So I'd like to welcome everybody to our speaker series at the Center for Latin American and Border Studies. My name is Inigo Garcia Bryce. I'm on the advisory board. I'm a professor in the Department of History. And Dr. David Ortiz, who directs the center, asked me to take his place today because he has class and therefore has to be in class. However, since we do record these lectures, I know he's looking forward to hearing the recording. Now, it's a distinct pleasure for me to introduce Michael Shifter, whom I have known for many, many years. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Lima, Peru, when he directed the Ford Foundation's Governance and Human Rights, the Ford Foundation's Governance and Human Rights for the Andean region and the Southern Cone. Michael, who got his MA from Harvard University, has been following Latin American politics for many decades and is an expert on the region. He not only writes about it, but also travels and has met a number of prominent political figures in the region, therefore getting a very firsthand experience of Latin American politics. He's published articles in a number of publications that include the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times, Current History, the Washington Post, and many others, and is also consulted as an expert by many of these same publications. He's also written in leading newspapers and journals in Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He is former president of the InterAmerican Dialogue, a leading policy forum on Western Hemisphere affairs in Washington, D.C., and he is now a senior fellow at that institution. The students at Georgetown University are very fortunate to have him as a professor. He's an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service. And today we are fortunate to be able to share in his expertise on Latin American politics with the lecture that he's going to give us today on the pink tide in Latin America, or the second pink tide in Latin America. So normally I would say, please help me welcome Michael Shifter. But of course, since we now exist in this virtual universe, he won't be able to hear all of you clapping. So I guess I'll just do the clapping for everybody and welcome Michael Shifter to our speaker series here at NMSU.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Inigo, for that very kind introduction, and really, really appreciate it. And we have known each other for many years, and I really value our friendship and relationship with our beloved Peru. And I also just want to thank the Center for Latin American and Border Studies for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today, and appreciate all of you who've joined. It's really a delight for me to be here, albeit virtually, and I look forward to your questions and a good exchange. Today in Latin America, I think wherever you look, there's enormous political uncertainty and volatility. The region is not in a very good period. Many authors have talked about the perfect storm, which I won't go through all the factors, but if you include sort of the global environment and some of the problems in the region following the devastating effects of the pandemic, economic stagnation and the like, social discontent, upheaval, and so forth. There's just it's very hard to predict where the region will go politically, and I think there's nowhere more striking to illustrate this than Brazil, where there will be a runoff vote on Sunday between Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, and Jair Bolsonaro. On October 2nd, when there was the first round, many analysts who were guided and instructed by the polls were left a bit with their egg on their face and embarrassed after Bolsonaro defied expectations and came within 5 points of Lula, forcing a second round. Will take place on Sunday. I'm not going to predict what's going to happen on Sunday, but I will confidently predict that should Lula emerge victorious, virtually every media account will talk about the left turn, perhaps calling it a new pink tide, with only 3 countries in South America that are not considered leftist: Ecuador, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And at some level, you can call that a trend or tendency to the left. And to some extent, I think it means a bit less emphasis on than there had been on market-oriented policies that were pursued by Mauricio Macri and Sebastián Piñera in Chile, and Iván Duque in Colombia, and Peña Nieto in Mexico, and more attention to the social agenda and an expanded role of the state. But the question is that I'd like to address: is it really useful and accurate to characterize what's going on, especially should Lula win, as a new pink tide? And might that term actually obfuscate more than it illuminates? And I want to offer an alternative interpretation or explanation of what's going on, which I think is a bit more compelling. And that is that Latin Americans are not necessarily leaning more to the left than before. All polls indicate that basically most Latin Americans are somewhere in the middle, sometimes a little bit more to the left, sometimes a little more to the right. But these kind of sort of sharp shifts are not borne out by at least the surveys and the polls that have been taken. But that there is enormous discontent, frustration, and anger that's being translated into rejection of incumbent presidents and parties, no matter what the ideological stripe. And understandably, Latin Americans are, if they're not happy, they look for alternatives. And if Lula wins, I think you could reasonably say that it will not only the continuation of the left or the restoration of the left in Brazil, but also an anti-incumbent vote that punished Bolsonaro for his mismanagement of the pandemic, his mismanagement of the economy, and his relentless assaults on democracy and human rights that have fueled extreme societal polarization. And in fact, the only government since 2015 or so where the incumbent was reelected has been in Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, which is obviously hardly a model of free and fair elections. And all other places, incumbents have lost during this period of stagnation and social upheaval. And I think what we see is that the current group of left-leaning leaders is very different from what was called the pink tide back in the early 2000s, or the first decade of the century, that started with the election of Hugo Chavez of Venezuela in 1998 and gained steam over the subsequent years with Evo Morales, Rafael Correa of Ecuador, Nestor Kirchner of Argentina. Lula himself was part of the so-called pink tide in the early 2000s when he governed from 2003 to 2011. And also Ricardo Lagos in Chile, Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay. And during that first wave, thanks largely to high prices of commodities that were consumed in large measure by China to meet its development needs, South America in particular had a real party that resulted in high growth rates that were sustained over a period, important reductions in poverty and even inequality in many countries, and an explosion of the middle class. During the years of Lula, the 8 years of Lula, the middle class in Brazil increased by some 30 million. So, which is something that he is understandably talking a lot about in the current campaign against Bolsonaro. And in those days, back then, it was fun governing. There were lots of resources to spend on domestic priorities. And in the case of Lula, and especially Hugo Chavez, on a very activist foreign policy. And you had groups that emerged, some more ideological than others, called ALBA, in the case of Chavez's group, UNASUR, which was also supported by Chavez and also Lula, CELAC, which included, UNASUR was just all the South American countries, CELAC is all Latin American countries, including Cuba, and of course, excluding the United States and Canada, to seen as presented as an alternative or even a challenge to traditional regional organizations like the Organization of American States. But it's not surprising that many of these leaders were able to stay in office many years. Unlike today, being an incumbent back in those days was a real political asset because the global environment was very favorable, very benign, and there was lots of money to spend. Of course, even back then, there were very profound differences among these leaders and governments that were often ignored or downplayed in many media accounts. Jorge Castaneda of Mexico wrote extensively about this, but if you go even within those names that I mentioned, who were part of the first pink tide, there were very sharp differences on the commitment to democratic institutions, economic and social policies, levels of corruption, and approaches to dealing with the US and other external actors. Recall Hugo Chavez's belligerence towards the United States, towards Washington, in contrast to Lula's quite good relationship back then with George W. Bush. And of course, you had the leaders from Chile and Uruguay, in the case of Chile, Ricardo Lagos, and then Michelle Bachelet, and the case of Uruguay, Tabaré Vázquez and Pepe Mujica, that were a little bit more accommodationist, more conventional in their approaches to economic policy, more moderate and more pragmatic. Lula was in the middle, and then more radical figures like Chavez, Rafael Correa, and Evo Morales. But even if you compare Chavez and Evo Morales, there were important differences. Bolivia was the poster child for a number of years for the World Bank for its macroeconomic management, which was very sound. It was managed by the current president, who was then finance minister, now President Luis Arce. So even within this group that are considered more, let's say, hardline, more authoritarian figures on the left, there were differences in their economic management. They all had a good run, but then it turned to in many countries to more center or right of center government. But then there are even lines that are blurred about what's left and right, which raises questions about the utility of these terms today. López Obrador, for example, considered by some to be a leader of the left, and Bolsonaro clearly of the right, but in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was considerably more spending on social programs and payments to the poor in Brazil. and a somewhat austere restrained spending program under López Obrador in Mexico. And yet Bolsonaro is a rightist leader and López Obrador a leftist. Indeed, in the case of López Obrador, there are growing doubts whether it really is accurate to describe him as a leader of the left. He increasingly relies on the Mexican military as a pillar of his support. And so, and there has been a lot of criticisms about his increasing authoritarian moves and removal of checks and balances on his authority and power. So even these categories of left and right, I think, are problematic. And if we move to the current day, first taking three countries that I think were once considered, and many may still consider to be leftist, but I certainly would raise questions about it. In the case of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, my view is that it would be a stretch to characterize these as leftist governments. There is really no sign of a real interest, concern, focus on ideology, no vision for the future, but really an emphasis on perpetuating authoritarian regimes in power. And I don't see, all of them may have had leftist projects at some point, but I think in 2022, I see little evidence that those projects have survived. Now, let's turn to the more recent governments that I think sort of prompted this whole, this talk, which have fed this narrative that we've seen in the press and that we might see if Lula's is elected on Sunday, of the new pink tide, and focus on three cases, one, Peru, and then Chile, and most recently Colombia with the election of Gustavo Petro. In Peru, I think that my view of Pedro Castillo's election there was a reflection of a call for greater social justice in Peru. Peru is a profoundly unequal society, and I think that some of Castillo's rhetoric and promises clearly called for greater redistribution and greater attention to those who had been excluded from the country's economy and areas of power and decision making. Today, however, over a year after his first government, he is an embattled president, facing 6 cases of corruption that are being pursued by prosecutors. And I think what's clear is that the issue is not one of ideology, which many people believed when he was first elected, but one of just competence and ability to manage a very complex society and a very complex economy. And there have been various attempts at impeaching him. They haven't worked. There haven't been enough votes, and he may well survive. But it's hard to see a lot of progress in Peru on either domestic or the foreign policy front, when clearly there's a desperate need for progress. The country, paradoxically, or I think the big puzzle is always that the economy seems to do pretty well. Peru is growing, and it has been a good performer, but the politics have been very problematic, and we'll see if it can sustain a positive economic performance in the face of this very troubling deterioration and decay in the political sphere, which has always been a problem. And certainly when I lived there in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was a problem. But I think it's worsened in recent years. So let's turn to the two cases that I think most people are talking about today, and Chile and Colombia. I lived in Chile in the early 1990s after I left Lima, Peru. I was there for a couple of years, and I actually studied in Colombia international relations and political science in the 70s, in the mid 1970s. So I've had some experience in both countries. In the case of Chile, first Chile, Gabriel Boric was, I think, elected at 36 years old, the same age, by the way, as Alan Garcia, Peru, when he became president in 1985 in Peru. I hope that Boric does better than Alan Garcia in his government. But Boric is struggling. He's only been in office for 7 months, but his approval level now is 27%. So in part, that's because the country is drafted a new constitution that he supported, but that was overwhelmingly rejected in a vote that was put to Chileans. And I think more important than that, in my view, is that the situation in Chile is just very, very difficult. High levels of inflation and increasing crime in various parts of the country that have created a very sour mood. And of course, the Chileans blame the young president for that. I do think Boric is certainly a leftist, but I think almost occupies a unique space in Latin American politics. He is kind of a postmodern young president, focus on inclusion, diversity, climate change, and also a foreign policy whose lines are being delineated now that really takes a strong stand against other governments of the left that are silent about what's happening in Venezuela and Nicaragua. He said in a recent speech, in fact, that it pisses me off, and I use that in quotes, pisses me off when leftist governments do not criticize Venezuela and Nicaragua. So he has a very strong, very commitment to democracy, committed to human rights. And, but he exemplifies the problems in 2022 and 2023 of any government, left or right, which is that he has limited fiscal space in which to operate, in which to meet increasingly high expectations and demands. The International Monetary Fund predicts that next year, the Latin America will grow just over 1%. And Chile is going to be in a very difficult economic situation. So I think you have somebody of the left, but takes a strong stand on issues of democracy, human rights. I think he is a Democrat, and he is committed to climate change. He's also very much interested in deepening relations with the United States. Gustavo Petro was almost won in the last presidential election in Colombia. And again, I think I would underscore in his case, here's somebody who was a former guerrilla of the M19, spent many years in Congress and as a senator. And I think his coming to the presidency in Colombia is extremely important. Colombia has always been characterized as kind of an elitist culture. There was an important article that was written many years ago called "The Conversation entre Caballeros." But that's the way that, that's the way the politics works. It was exclusionary. And I think Petro has broken that, which I think is important and healthy for Colombia in the long run. And more than Petro, I think it's his vice president, Francia Marquez, Afro-Colombian activist for many, many years on social justice issues, which is a hugely important position and a hugely important gain for Colombia, as well as Colombia's ambassador here in Washington, who is also Afro-Colombian, the first time that's ever happened. So again, with Petro, there's an emphasis on inclusion and diversity. It's very symbolic. It's very historic what's happening. But he's only been in office since early August, and his numbers, which were well over 60%, have also declined. In fact, in over the last month, he's now at 45%. And there again, the issues are not unlike Chile, which are high inflation and insecurity. Insecurity from criminal groups, insecurity from remnants of the FARC, the Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, most of whom reached an agreement in peace agreement in 2016, but there are dissident forces that continue to engage. And of course, there's just common crime, which is increasing in many major cities. And there's a sour mood, and of course, Petro has lost some support as a result. Perhaps the most critical test is now a serious tax reform that's being considered and reviewed in Congress. I think that will be a test. I think Petro wants to push hard on tax reform to have the wealthy pay their fair share, but he doesn't want the wealthy to leave the country, because I think he understands that he needs the private sector, Colombian private sector, in the country in order to invest and in order to grow the economy. He's also, I think, for now, he believes he needs the United States on board as well. I think Colombia has been a sort of a leading strategic ally of the United States for many years, and I think while Petro doesn't want to go to that extent, I think he understands that continued cooperation and engagement from the United States is important. I think here there's one point that I want to stress again, as a leftist, and which Petro is, which is very different from the others that we've seen, certainly Boric or Castillo, which is that it's clear by now that that Petro aspires to be not only a leader in Colombia, to transform Colombia, but a leader on the regional and global stage. I think Colombia is too small for him, as Venezuela was too small for Hugo Chavez. If you listen to his speech at the UN General Assembly meeting in September, very, very aggressive tone against the United States, highlighting two issues. One is the failed war on drugs, which has had a heavy toll in many countries, but particularly in Colombia, and also climate change and a call for climate action. And that has been a very, very major focus of Petro. And recently, he was very outspoken and sharply critical of US economic policy, and particularly high interest rates in the United States, saying that the US should be much more mindful and take into account the impact that such decisions have on economies like Colombia's. So he is very outspoken. He's moving very fast on many different fronts. And he's moved to reestablish relations with neighboring Venezuela and the Maduro regime, which had been broken since 2018. And there is at least a possibility that he will try to play a role as a mediator between the United States and Venezuela as that relationship becomes redefined in the coming period. Colombia could play an important role in the US-Venezuela relationship. And Colombia could also play a role, and we'll see if this happens, in trying to encourage a democratic transition in Venezuela. The situation there, according to every reliable report we know, is very, very serious in terms of human rights. And there have been over 7 million Venezuelan refugees that have left the country since 2015. So this is it's been a calamitous situation. And really the only way to stop that or to change that is to try to move towards a more democratic and a more economically viable situation in Venezuela. We'll see if Colombia plays a role in that. But they're taking these two cases. There are considerable differences between Boric and Petro. Boric is in Chile. Its economy relies on copper, extraction of copper. Petro has said repeatedly that he's against extractives, that we can't rely on extractives. So there's a very difference there. Even after the vote on the Constitution, after it was rejected, Gustavo Petro tweeted, "Revivió Pinochet. Pinochet is back," which was, I think, very uncomfortable for Boric, and certainly not the way anybody else that I know saw that vote. There were a lot of people that were not, most of the people who rejected that were not, didn't want Pinochet to come back, a very small percentage of them. So there again, he is not reticent about weighing in on a lot of different issues. And he has abstained on a vote in the OAS and elsewhere on condemning Nicaragua. So unlike Boric, I think he is going to be much more reluctant to standing up to human rights violations and the erosion of democracy in left countries. So then we go to the big question, I think, which is what happens if Lula does get elected on Sunday? What can he accomplish? Because I think if we're talking about any leftist trend or new pink tide, Lula and Brazil are just so important. And there's an interesting debate among academics and analysts about what Lula can do. Some say that he could do very little because he'll be so constrained on the domestic front. Bolsonaro in the first round of the elections has ample control of Congress, has many of his people in Congress. There are high levels of polarization, and the fact that Bolsonarismo, the Bolsonaro movement that he inspired, is here to stay will complicate governing for Lula. In addition, the economic situation is very difficult. And Bolsonaro himself is spending so much to get reelected on Sunday that the fiscal outlook will be even worse. In addition, the global outlook is very grim. Latin America is not what it was in the 2000s. It's highly fragmented and very inward looking, as we saw in the pandemic. Each country is kind of fending for itself. But others say Brazilian politics is such that Lula, despite these conditions, would be able to make deals and negotiate, even with some of those who were previously with Bolsonaro. And also the Bolsonaro's movement will fracture, giving an opportunity so Lula might succeed. I see very little prospect of what concretely and pragmatically can be done in terms of regional integration. The only thing that I think might happen, and hopefully will happen, is some sort of effort to support the Amazon, that many South American countries border the Amazon. They have a lot at stake. As we know, it's an issue of enormous global concern, and in some ways, the health of the planet itself is on the line. And perhaps that's something that even the United States can support. But the outlook is very different than the 2000s, that Lula's former foreign minister and current main advisor on foreign policy, Celso Amorim, has in interviews and articles talked about trying to revive UNASUR, that emerged in 2008. But it's unclear what realistically that could accomplish. I would suspect that Brazil, if Lula is elected, would convene a meeting of South American leaders. But again, beyond the Amazon question, it's unclear to me what really else can be done given the conditions in 2023. So will Boric deliver? Will Petro deliver? Will Lula deliver if he's elected? It's going to be very, very hard. Those questions were not asked so pointedly during the first pink tide, the 2000s, because it's a lot easier to deliver when you have a lot of revenue coming in, and China is playing a very significant role in purchasing your commodities. China is not playing the kind of role that it did in that first pink tide. And so it's obviously still an important partner from most Latin American countries, but it's simply the scale of China's engagement is not what it was back then. And so it's going to be very difficult. There are just enormous constraints on all of these leftist, left-leaning leaders. And we just have to look at Argentina, which has elections less than a year from now, to see what happens. Argentina, the election of Alberto Fernandez, who defeated Mauricio Macri of the right, seen as part of this new pink tide. And elections are a year from now, but inflation is 80%. There's been a dramatic increase in poverty in Argentina. And it looks now, although it's hard to predict what will happen anywhere, that the opposition in Argentina has a good chance of coming back in December of next year. Let me conclude, and then I would like to open it up, if that's okay, on 2 points having to do, one has to do with China precisely. This is, I think, an issue that to a large extent unifies Latin America. I gave a talk recently to US government officials, pretty similar to the one I'm giving to you, talking about the nature of leftist governments in Latin America and the fact that if Lula wins, we'd only have 3 that are not left of the left. And the question somebody asked was, well, because they're mostly leftist, does that mean that China is going to deepen its engagement even further? And my response was, it really doesn't matter if they're left or right. I think China is interested in the region because of its own agenda, its own development priorities. And I think there could be governments of the left or the right, and if they will be helpful to China, China will want to cooperate with them. So Latin America, I think, clearly has a posture that I see all governments having as wanting to be independent, not choosing sides, and being essentially pragmatic. It's not that they would prefer to deal with China than the United States, but if the China is offering more and offers a better opportunity, they're not going to hesitate. The United States, here I want to make 2 points. The Secretary of State made a recent trip precisely to Colombia, Chile, and Peru, and to show that the United States was very interested and wanted to engage with governments of the left. That was part of, I think, the message that Tony Blinken conveyed in each of those stops. I think it was a good trip, and I think he did well. I think he said the right things. There was a respectful tone. With Colombia and Petro, I think some anticipated some more tension. And clearly the US is a little on the defensive on its drug policy, but there's also, I think, a sense in the US government that policy is not working. And the challenge is to try to figure out an alternative that works and also can get political support. I think it was, I think there was, it was pretty positive. The problem is that in US politics, the priorities are clearly elsewhere for engagement, for cooperation, and not in this hemisphere. So the Secretary of State had a good trip. I think he conveyed the right message, but I see it as very difficult that he and other senior officials will be able to sustain a focus on the region, and simply the resources that are available are not going to be directed to Latin America. It's simply not a priority in the scheme of things, taking the war in Europe and China and lots of other priorities. But I do want to conclude with one positive note about US policy. And as somebody who has been critical of US policy, Latin American policy for many years, I do think that the Biden administration has done the right thing in conveying messages, public and private, by many senior officials to Brazil, that it will recognize quickly the result that the electoral authorities announce on Sunday night, that they have expressed high confidence in the electoral system that has been questioned by Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters, and that even the Secretary of Defense, Austin, in a meeting in Brazil, couldn't have been clearer on that score. So I think, again, what happens in Brazil is very important for South America, for the whole hemisphere, and there are concerns about what's going to happen on Sunday and the days after Sunday, and hopefully things will be peaceful. But I think the United States has done and said the right things in that regard, and we'll just have to see what happens. So I think when you go, if it's okay, I'll leave it there, and just delighted to entertain any questions or comments anybody has.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk, Michael. I do have some questions. What I'll do is the questions are put in the chat and I can just read them out in the order that they came in. The first question, how can you say that there is no focus on ideology in Cuba when they just passed a new family bill, which is further in line with Marx's call for abolishing the family than what we can see in the West?
I'm sorry, to get the last part of that.
That they've just passed a new family
Right.
bill, which is further in line with Karl Marx's call for abolishing the family than what we can see in the West.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's an incompatibility to say that there's, that ideology, the point is that, there's ideology everywhere, and no government is without ideology, but it's certainly not. And this measure was, which I applaud, was no surprise. I think that people were predicting it, but I don't think you could argue that it really is, fundamentally it really points to a vision of the future for Cuba. I mean, this is from all accounts, Cuba is just in a disastrous humanitarian situation. More Cubans have left and come and crossed the border of the United States in the last year than in many, many, many years. So what is the legitimacy of the government? The legitimacy used to be the revolution, Fidel Castro and all of that, but that's gone. Fidel is gone. And so I don't, to say that it's not driven by ideology doesn't mean necessarily that these kinds of measures can happen. They can happen anywhere, but I don't see it. And it may be better than the West, and that's fine. But it's not enough to sustain the legitimacy of the government when everybody is desperately trying to get out, as far as I can tell.
All right, thank you. Another question. How do you see the treatment of drug violence by the different leftist administrations?
Well, what I can say is, I mean, that's a great question. And in the case of what the most interesting case in that regard is Chile, which is not a country that was normally associated with, with drug violence. And Boric, as a student leader and then in the campaign, had a very kind of progressive, view of, ways to, to dialogue, to be much more accommodating, not accommodating, but not a mano duro, not a hard line, not a use of force, but trying to pursue other approaches to dealing with it. And of course, he's found himself in a very, very difficult situation where the violence has increased, and he has changed he's evolved in his thinking and talks about, the legitimate use of force to maintain public order, and has emphasized that. And of course, politically, that's, he has to be there. He's not going to the extreme, but he's certainly changed from at least, what he had been before. What's interesting is what's happening in Colombia as well, which is, and this could be a point of difference between the United States and Colombia. We'll see how the details are fleshed out. But, Gustavo Petro has talked about his plan of paz total, total peace. And that means not only trying to renegotiate with the dissident factions of the FARC, and also to pursue a negotiation with the other major guerrilla group, the ELN, Ejército de Liberación Nacional, but also with drug cartels and drug trafficking organizations. And we'll see how that works. He has talked about that, and he has said to the United States basically that if he can reach a deal with these people, that he is not going to extradite them, because they feel they're going to be extradited. They have very little incentive to negotiate. So that is an area that we'll see how that evolves. And then of course, in Mexico, I mentioned López Obrador's alliance with the military. I mean, I think it's one of the, just looking at Latin America as a whole, to me, it's one of the most both surprising and disturbing developments in all of Latin America. Many people had questions about López Obrador when he came in, but I don't know anybody who felt that, within 3 or 4 years that he'd be, essentially militarizing all the functions of public order, internal public order. So it's true that, police is corrupt, but, the military has a very bad record as well. And we all know what happens when there's militarization in other countries. So, we'll see. And remember, when he came in, he said, López Obrador, he said, abrazos, no balazos. That was his slogan. And he seems to have moved considerably from that position. So I think there are different approaches, but it's a very important test of the leftist leaders in the region.
Thank you. The next question, what about ending American sanctions on and interference in Venezuela, which are crippling the economy? Wouldn't that be a surefire way to improve the economic situation of Venezuela?
I totally agree. I've been calling for that for a long time. I think that the sanctions have been totally, counterproductive. And I think not only, but I think they're moving towards that position to lifting that. What they want to do, what the administration wants to do, is use it as a bargaining tool if the U.S. lifts the sanctions tomorrow, the argument is they have very little leverage in trying to get Maduro to a negotiating table to have the conditions for free and fair elections, which are scheduled for the end of 2024. So the argument is that, I think they're beginning to ease the sanctions already. And then the argument is, well, to use the sanctions, they would lift them if Maduro is prepared to go back to the negotiating table. If not, the argument is that you lift all the sanctions. It may ease the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, but it just doesn't change the political reality. And that's the debate. But I've been a very, obviously I've been very strong critic of the Cuban embargo since I've been involved in Latin America for 40 years or 50 years or whatever it's been. I happened to be in Cuba by chance when the announcement was made by Barack Obama and Raul Castro that they were, normalizing relations. And I couldn't have been happier. And I'm against the sanctions in Venezuela, but I think that's the argument. But I think they're moving there. They're moving there in part because of the global oil markets and what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and also because, the policy has failed. Clearly it's failed. I mean, the sanctions were supposed to bring about democracy, and what it's brought about is strengthening of the Maduro regime. So I think they're beginning to move in that direction. I should mention that in both of these cases, I'm sure most people on this seminar will know that domestic politics is not irrelevant. The community concentrated in South Florida, if you lift the embargo and you lift sanctions, there's going to be a strong reaction. Now, they could deal with that reaction, but I'm just saying that has to be factored into understanding why the administration does or doesn't do policy in regard to both Venezuela and Cuba.
All right, thank you. I realize I hadn't been mentioning the names of the people, so I will do that. Who the first question was from Aaron Wills.
Okay.
The second one from Omar Carrillo, and then the third from an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
The next two, I'm going to merge the next two questions. I think it makes sense to do that.
Okay.
Christopher Brown, does our speaker believe that Bolsonaro will accept the results if he loses the election, or are we going to see a Brazilian Trump scenario? And the next question from Sandra Garavano, do you think that the extreme right is growing in the region?
Well, yeah, those are great questions. I think, let me just say on Bolsonaro, I mean, look, I'm in touch with all of the people on Brazil who know a lot more than I do, a lot more knowledgeable. And so if they don't know what Bolsonaro is going to do, then I don't know. But I certainly would not rule out a scenario that we saw in this country. There are a lot of connections, and there are a lot of parallels and a lot of commonalities. And so if you read about Bolsonaro's movement, there is this sense that he's this kind of he was offered by God to save, he's the savior of Brazil. And I think one thing that a lot of analysts underestimated was the strength of this sort of indoctrination campaign in Brazil, and sort of building on this, very conservative strain that has always existed there, but really has been worked very, very well. Strong communications strategy by the Bolsonaro people. Yeah, I think it's altogether possible. What I don't think is that I don't think the military, this is maybe wasn't asked this, but this is the related question. Will the military, support Bolsonaro? I don't think so. Every evidence that I have is that the Bolsonaro, there could be trouble, there could be strong reactions, but that the military will hold the line. That they've put out a number of declarations that I've seen that have been very positive in that regard. So now, you don't want a sort of a bloody conflict, but I think that Bolsonaro and his people might attempt something, but I think democracy will hold in Brazil, but with a lot of turbulence. On the right in Latin America, I spoke to a journalist on this the other day. I mean, the right needs to reevaluate itself because they lost, they used the card that Mexico is going to be the next Venezuela, and then Peru was going to be the next Venezuela, and then Chile was going to be the next Venezuela with border, and now Gustavo Petro would make it the next Venezuela. In all cases, they lost. And the specter of communism and the specter of are scare tactics that I don't think they may work with some sectors of society, but I don't think they work with the whole sector. And of course, we're seeing that in the case of Brazil as well. So I think there is, getting to the question, there is the phenomena, which I think needs a lot more attention, of the evangelical movement, which is a very significant base of support for Bolsonaro. And again, it's mixed in with this kind of sense of religion that he's been sort of offered by God and all of that. And that's very important in politics, but it was true in Peru, as you know, and it was true in other places as well. But it's very, very powerful in Brazil. I'm not sure if it's as relevant, spread of evangelicalism in other Latin American countries or South American countries than it is in Brazil, but clearly that merits a lot of analysis. But I think there is what's happening. The final comment is, given what's happening in the world and given what happened in the United States, there's more space for those conservative, movements that have always been there, but have been kind of latent, really to come to the fore. So yes, I think we're going to see that. We have seen it in some countries already, and I think we're going to see more of that. But as far as I can tell, the right in general has no positive policy agenda at all. I mean, there are all these problems in Latin America, and what is the right proposing? Going back to the free market is not going to work, but they're not coming up with a positive vision. They're really just resorting to the scare tactics and what I think are very hyperbolic kind of warnings that you've got to vote against the leftist figure, which again haven't worked in recent elections.
Thank you. The next question is from Neil Harvey. Thank you for your insightful presentation. When it comes to U.S. interest in the region, it seems that one issue that needs to be discussed more is migration, which is often provoked by the problems you mentioned: climate change, economic crises, insecurity, and corruption and impunity. Can the formation of an alternative to the current model of contention of undocumented migration unite these governments by seriously addressing root causes together, since each nation has to deal with new patterns of migration? How serious is the US government in developing such an alternative?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad Mr. Harvey asked that. We just had a summit of the Americas in Los Angeles in June, which brought together all of the heads of state. A lot of them attended, some of them didn't. Lopez Obrador didn't attend, and some of the Central Americans. But if you ask somebody what came out of that summit, there was a declaration on migration, saying that this is a hemispheric problem, that all countries are affected by migration. Sure, a lot of it coming to the U.S. border, but there are also other flows going to other countries and from other regions, and there needed to be much more coordinated effort. And they set up a bunch of standards. Some of these, were dealt with root causes and saying, and others said, we're not going to, migration just has to be managed more effectively. You have to also respect human rights. There has to be a kind of a more kind of rational approach to dealing with migration. But look, the United States does this. They're very proud of this accomplishment. And what do? What's the latest decision? They're sending Venezuelans back who have tried to cross the border back to Mexico under this what's called Title 42, which is a provision that came from for health reasons, basically saying because of COVID. And everybody said this is this not only is it's just is kind of a step backwards, but it also violates the principles that the Declaration contained, which the United States promoted in June, just a few months ago in Los Angeles. So if you want other countries to adhere to these principles that were worked on very hard by, the Secretary of State and his staff and everything, if the United States violates them, 4 months later, it's hard for other governments to take them seriously. So I wholeheartedly agree with the question and the spirit of the question, but I'm not optimistic that a lot of progress could be made because there are these politics. And in the case of the United States, we know what the politics are, especially a few weeks before midterms, and the importance of migration, and Venezuelans were flowing over the border. And now they had to send them back to Mexico because they just want to see the numbers go down, and they want to reduce the chance that it's going to be an issue in the elections. So I'd like to say that domestic politics doesn't matter or shouldn't drive it, but unfortunately it does. And when the United States promotes something that it violates soon after, it doesn't send the right signal to the rest of the hemisphere.
Thank you. The next question is somewhat similar, perhaps with a little bit of a different emphasis. Your thoughts on the tides of illegal immigration to the U.S. from Latin Americans, from Central and South America. This is from Lucinda Vargas. From Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, and U.S. foreign policy toward these immigrants, sending countries and U.S. immigration policy per se. The tide is definitely Latin American. So here comes the question. Should the U.S. step up efforts of programs to help these countries grow and thus aid in stemming the tide of the desperately poor fleeing these countries?
Yes, I think absolutely. I mean, if the Biden administration has been identified with any policy in Latin America, it's attacking the root causes and trying to create economic opportunities and protection and the rule of law and strengthen justice systems and the like. This strategy, the root causes strategy, which Vice President Harris kind of oversees, has been very unsuccessful. And it's been unsuccessful because, unfortunately, the things are not going well within these countries. And if you don't have partners, I don't know what the United States can do if you don't have government partners that also have a will and a commitment to tackle these problems. And many of them don't, unfortunately. And so I don't see a lot of progress on that. And the other thing, even if there is progress, as we know, we're not going to see it in an electoral cycle. We'll see it in a generation. Progress would be very, very slow, even under the best circumstances. So I think it makes a lot of sense in theory, and I agree with it. And hopefully there will be the case that at some point that these societies will be thriving economically. They'll have economic opportunities for their people, and there'll be less of an incentive to migrate. But we're very far away from that. And you have to have people, governments, and leaders in place that are committed to having, private sectors paying their fair share of taxes, and just having policies that are geared to, education, educating the populations. And, you don't see that. The InterAmerican Dialogue is a very, very successful program on education in Latin America. And unfortunately, it's, the record has been very disappointing. So a lot of these things need to change. The United States has tried to do more, perhaps it should do more, but it's limited by what partners on the ground are doing. Having said that, I think that I think that we know what US policy in terms of, trying to reform a broken immigration system and policy, the last serious immigration reform in this country was in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. So, so much has changed, and yet it seems to be at a political impasse, and I think reflects the dysfunctionality more than anything else, dysfunctionality of the U.S. government. I mean, it's very, very unfortunate that we're in this place because there are just so many things that should be done, and it's clear, but you know, no side wants to give in to the other on some issues, and that's very, very sad.
Thank you. The next question is from David Aviles. Do you think that Chile can get a new constitution passed under the current administration?
Yes, I think so. It's going to be very much, I mean, it looks like it's going to be very much, you know, have a slightly different design than the other. There'll be more involvement of political figures. There'll be more involvement of experts along with citizens. So I think that was one of the lessons that I think emerged from the previous process. I think it just got out of tune with the vast majority of Chileans, as the vote showed. And so I think Boric and other senior officials understand that there needs to be another process, but with a different design that ensures that what comes out of it will be more of a consensus and more that, you know, that the Chilean people can accept. I think there's a desperate need for a new constitution. The 1980 constitution under Pinochet is, you know, is just, you know, it has no legitimacy, first of all, because it happened under dictatorship, and it just is not reflecting today's realities, and the need for the role of the state and the need for the recognition of the Mapuche population, and a lot of good things that were in the constitution that was rejected. But it was 399 articles. It was too long. And if people didn't like one article, they voted against it. That was, you know, the way it was presented. So it was not done not really thought through adequately. And I think, you know, Boric is coming back. And so, yes, I think that, you know, I think that there will be a new constitution that will be approved, hopefully approved, you know, under the Boric government.
Thank you. I'm going to throw in my own question.
Okay.
But given the question that I'm asking, I feel like those TV commentators that say, "Can you please, you know, you have a minute to comment on this because we are running out of time."
Okay.
When you began, I got the impression that you were going to almost do away with the terms left and right, that they don't really have much utility anymore. Right. And my question is, what do we do with those terms? In the past, there has been change over history in terms of what it means to be left and right, but do you think that we're at a point where those terms are going to come to mean something else, or they've just become useless as analytical tools?
You know, I think they've look, this has been a lost cause for me. You know, I've been, you know, sort of on this for 20 years at least. And I kind of gave in. I surrendered because, you know, everybody uses them, and I have to communicate with somebody. I mean, it has to be a common, you know, some terms that are common to both. So I kind of gave in, but, you know, what I'm saying is that they still have some utility, but they're not the most important thing. That's what I'm saying. That I think that sometimes they're seen as kind of ideology is driving everything, and people on the left and right. And I think if you just kind of look below the surface, there are other things that are not left or right. And then I think, you know, there is this sort of constant redefinition and evolving what it means to be left or right. I mean, and you can look at it, you know, you can look at a lot of different, you know, issues. And I think they've changed considerably over time. So I guess where I come out on that is, you know, don't completely discard it. Keep up with the times and keep adapting it to realities, but I just don't think it's the most powerful explanation for what's happening. and it's not the most useful for what's happening. I just think that there are other ways to understand it. And sometimes I think people get misled because they say it's a leftist government and they assume certain things, and those things just don't, aren't happening. So one has to be just very, very careful. I guess it's just my main point.
I guess we have time for one last question, barely. But this is from Omar Carrillo. What is the current assessment of the U.S. of the pink wave in Latin America?
Well, I think what Blinken said in his trip, I think reflects that. I think they applaud the inclusion of Afro descendants, of the the recognition of the Mapuches in Chile, the fact that the Chilean Constitutional Assembly was 50% male and 50% female. The Biden administration is extremely supportive and sympathetic to that, and I think it generally sympathetic. I just think that Blinken said, that where we worry is if there are violations of democratic practice and democratic norms and democratic behaviors, that we're not going to judge countries on if they're left or not. It's what importance is democracy. Of course, that's a much harder sell to make today than it was years ago, when we see on our own country democracy under threat, and that was alluded to before. I mean, that rings a little bit more hollow to Latin Americans, perhaps, than it did some years ago. So, but that's kind of the position, basically. I'm sure, I have no doubt in my mind, although the United States would not say this, that I'm sure that they're hoping that Lula is elected on Sunday. As you know, Biden, Bolsonaro didn't even recognize Biden as the elected president of the United States. They just met once at the summit in Los Angeles, and the only reason I think Bolsonaro went is because he thought it would help him, maybe with some more moderates, getting more moderate votes for his re-election campaign. But there's no love lost there. So, I'm sure the hoping that Lula will be elected, and that that somehow they'll be recognized by the other side. That's what they'll be watching for. But I can't imagine. I'm sure that, and there'd be a lot better relations with the United States under Lula. I mean, there's been nothing happening under Bolsonaro. He's a complete pariah, regionally and globally. So this is, in the most important Latin American country, biggest economy. So I have no doubt that they're hoping that Lula will come back, and there'll be problems and differences, and but certainly much more preferable than Bolsonaro.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a fascinating talk and conversation. I want to thank the participants for their excellent questions, and primarily thanks to you, Michael, for this wonderful talk, for sharing your knowledge on the region. And sure, hopefully we can have you visit in person at some point.
That would be terrific. I'd love that. Thank you very much, and really appreciate the opportunity. And thanks to everybody for their great questions, and thanks to you, Inigo, for hosting this, and the center as well.
Thank you.